The year is 2009. The Alabama Crimson Tide were entering their third year under the reign of Nick Saban, and they were coming off a crushing loss in the 2008 SEC Championship game to the eventual national champion Florida Gators as the #1 ranked team in the BCS, and it caused them to lose their chance at Miami Gardens, Florida, and the Oklahoma Sooners in the BCS National Championship game. On the other side of the country, the Texas Longhorns led by Mack also fell just short of making the national championship game. The 2008 Texas Longhorns missed the Big 12 championship game in a three-way tie with Texas Tech and Oklahoma by 13 thousandths of a point. The Horns had a difficult schedule with #1 Oklahoma, #11 Missouri, 7th ranked Oklahoma State, and 6th ranked Texas Tech in 4 consecutive weeks. So let's start with Oklahoma. It's Red River, and essentially a battle for the Heisman Trophy between Sam Bradford and Colt McCoy. This might be the greatest Red River of all time considering the stakes involved, and the show on the field was a back and forth war. The Horns made a second half comeback to win by 10, 45-35, thanks to the performances of Colt McCoy and Jordan Shipley. They then beat Missouri 56-31 in a thrashing. The next week against Oklahoma State was a close battle where Texas would edge out a 28-24 win before the final test. Michael Crabtree, Graham Harrell, and the 6th ranked Texas Tech Red Raiders in Lubbock. And that's where it all come crashing down. The Red Raiders jumped out to a 22-3 lead with a minute 37 left in the half, which would be cut to a 22-6 lead at halftime. And then here come the Horns. They cut the lead to 10 at the end of the third quarter, 29-19, and then they'd storm all the way back for a 33-32 lead with a minute 29 to go. But the biggest mistake they made all year was scoring too early. It gave Harrell and Crabtree just enough time and luck, and after the Blake Gideon dropped interception, they reclaimed the lead with a second to go on one of the greatest plays in college football history. After that, the stunned Horns would win out the remaining 3 games, but the Red Raiders had one last test left, a trip to Norman, Oklahoma for a battle with the 5th ranked Oklahoma Sooners and Sam Bradford. Texas Tech was the new #2, but that ranking would be snatched from them in convincing fashion in a 65-21 loss. Oklahoma jumped out to a staggering 42-7 halftime lead, which was 52-7 just 5 minutes into the third quarter. So gone was Texas Tech chances at the national championship, but they were still in the race for the Big 12 title as the tiebreaker was chosen off the BCS rankings. And the Sooners' dominant showing against Texas Tech was enough to reclaim the #2 ranking, which would be right above #3 Texas, even though Texas had the edge in the AP poll. Had the Big 12 used SEC and ACC conference rules, it would have been Texas headed to the conference title over Oklahoma, valuing the head-to-head matchup. But who was ahead of both of them in the polls? Alabama. These Crimson Tide, unlike the Horns, wouldn't be denied a shot at their conference championship. And as the #1 seed, all they had to do was the not-so-easy task of defeating the national champions of 2 years ago, the Florida Gators led by Tim Tebow, Urban Meyer, and you know the rest of the cast. Alabama got to this point in pretty convincing fashion. In the preseason, unlike Oklahoma, who was 4th, Florida, who was 5th, and Texas, who was just outside the top 10 at 11, Alabama was 24th, which is understandable. It was year 2 of Saban, and in 2007 they had lost to Louisiana Monroe and lost 6 games on their schedule. But the difference now is the #1 rated wide receiver in the country coming out of high school and the 3rd overall rated player Julio Jones, who changed the entire trajectory of the program by shockingly staying in state to sign with Saban and the Tide in a heated recruiting battle over Florida State, Florida, and Oklahoma. Their quarterback, John Parker Wilson. He was average in 2007, but this was Alabama, and they had an elite running back on the way in 4-star Mark Ingram, who would join a running back room of Terry Grant and Glenn Coffey. The 2008 Alabama recruiting class set the stage for the dynasty. Joining those two was Barrett Jones, Terrence Cody, Mark Barron, Courtney Upshot, Dante Hightower, and a name that's really important to this video, maybe the most important, Marcel Darius. By the way, if you're enjoying this video, then please subscribe to the channel, as only 2% of you guys who watch the videos are subscribed. So make sure to subscribe and recruit a friend to hit the transfer portal and subscribe here too. Now on to 2008. They started this season with a dominating win over 9th ranked Clemson, 34-10. This bumped them to 13th in the polls, which will become 11th the next week, which became 9th, then 8th for their biggest game of the season up until this point. They'd be playing #3 Georgia in Athens in a blackout game. This Georgia team was the preseason #1, and they were led by eventual #1 pick Matthew Stafford, AJ Green, and Noshan Moreno. And this game in primetime would announce Nick Saban's Alabama's arrival to the scene. They absolutely stomped Georgia. They jumped out to a staggering 31-0 halftime lead. That true freshman Julio Jones would put on a show with 5 catches, 94 yards, and a touchdown on the biggest stage he's been on thus far. The Bulldogs did mount a little comeback to lose 41-30 thanks to 2 touchdowns in the final 3 minutes. So now we have a new #2, Alabama. And number 1 was Oklahoma, who, as we mentioned earlier, were hooked by the Horns. As a result, Colt and the Texas Longhorns were the new number 1. Also, as mentioned, Harrell to Crabtree happened, and now Alabama was finally number 1. In just year 2, Nick Saban had returned to the top of college football. And their first game as new number 1 was against LSU, Saban's former team, in Death Valley. Not at night though. But as I always say, LSU and Alabama in the late 2000s and early 10s might just be the peak of college football. In 2007, Alabama lost a heartbreaker to LSU and Bryant-Denny, 41-34 in the final seconds. Those Tigers would go on to win the national championship. But here's the thing, LSU's chances at a repeat were halted thanks to their quarterback situation. In 2005, LSU received a shocking commitment from the number 1 dual-threat quarterback in the country, Ryan Perrilloux. Perrilloux, who is the greatest high school player ever from the state of Louisiana, had flipped his commitment from Texas to LSU on signing day. First, he'd sit behind 2006 Heisman Trophy winner Jamarcus Russell, and then off-the-field issues would cause him to lose his chance at the starting job in 2007 to fifth-year senior Matt Flynn. But just because he wasn't a starter doesn't mean he didn't make an impact. Perrilloux was huge in a victory over the defending national champion Florida Gators in 2007, and he also started 2 games in 2007. Won a near 300-yard game against Middle Tennessee State where he threw for 3 touchdowns on an 80% completion percentage in relief of an injured Matt Flynn. And again he'd start late in the season where he'd win SEC Championship game MVP, leading LSU to a 30-20 win over Tennessee, throwing for 243 yards and a passing touchdown to send LSU to a national championship game appearance. As we know, Flynn would come back and beat Ohio State for the crown of the BCS, but Ryan Perrilloux was 100% the future of LSU football. The talent was on display, the confidence was there, he'd dominate in practice, but he couldn't get his off-the-field issues together, and Les Miles would dismiss him from the team. LSU would now have to lean on Jarrett Lee, the 4-star redshirt freshman, and Jordan Jefferson, also a 4-star but true freshman. This domino effect would result in the worst era of quarterback play in LSU history. Jarrett Lee wasn't ready and was thrust into action unexpectedly after the Harvard transfer Andrew Hatch went down, and he'd mightily struggle with turning the ball over. The rushing of the quarterback process killed his confidence, and Alabama would take advantage. And the LSU quarterback situation is one of the underrated factors that helped the Alabama dynasty thrive. Think of the names Brandon Harris, Anthony Jennings, Danny Etling. We can go on about the number of misses at the quarterback position in Baton Rouge, but it all started in 2008 with Jarrett Lee, who coming into the Alabama game had threw 5 pick sixes on the season, and things would get even worse against the Tide. Lee was picked on 4 separate occasions. His first throw of the game was intercepted. His second pick was yet again a pick 6. The third throw was only in a 7-point game, and the fourth came in a tie ball game in overtime. 4 detrimental interceptions and only a 6-point overtime loss sent Alabama to the SEC title after a dominant 36-0 victory in the Iron Bowl. Their opponent, Tim Tebow, Urban Meyer, and the Florida Gators. You all know the story about this team, but they'd be missing one key piece on this afternoon in Atlanta. Wideout Percy Harvin, far and away the most dynamic player on the Gators. Florida had only lost 1 game on the season. Tebow was stopped on 4th down against Ole Miss in a 31-30 loss. Then came the famed Tebow promise speech, and from that point on, the Gators put up a dominating showing against LSU in a 51-21 win, a revenge game against Stafford and Georgia in a 49-10 win using all 3 timeouts, and 2 40-plus outings against top 25 teams when they beat 25th ranked South Carolina 56-6 and Florida State where they won 55-15. So it was now 1 vs 4 for the SEC championship, but most importantly, a win and end for the BCS title with no Percy Harvin on the field. Could quarterback John Parker Wilson, true freshman Julio Jones, and Nick Saban beat the champs of 2 years ago? Unfortunately for the Tide, the efforts of Julio Jones and Glenn Coffey would not be enough. Coffey would run for 112 yards and a touchdown. Meanwhile, Julio Jones caught 124 of John Parker Wilson's 187 pass yards. The stark contrast in quarterback play made all the difference. Tebow without Harvin still threw for 3 touchdowns and 216 yards with 0 interceptions, unlike Parker who did throw an interception. The 31-20 loss would send Alabama to the Sugar Bowl where they'd lose to Utah. And for Texas, well, since they missed out on the Big 12 title, they'd be sent to the Fiesta Bowl to face the Buckeyes while their rivals Oklahoma played for a national championship. This would also directly lead to Sam Bradford winning the Heisman over Colt McCoy. As mentioned earlier, Alabama lost to Utah. The final score was 31-17 in the Sugar Bowl. Meanwhile, the Texas Longhorns would hold off a late comeback by the young Terrell Pryor to win 24-21 thanks to the performances of Colt McCoy and Quan Cosby in what would be Quan's final game as a Longhorn. But now the stage was set for 2009, and for both Alabama and Texas, it was about revenge and unfinished business. The goal was clear: Pasadena, California. Starting with the Texas Longhorns, starting quarterback Colt McCoy would return for his senior season, and his roommate Jordan Shipley was clearly the #1 receiver after the departure of Quan Cosby. The defense was led by Sergio Kendall, Sam Acho, and the fiery defensive coordinator Will Muschamp. But one true freshman that you have to know goes by the name of Garrett Gilbert, the son of Gale. He was the number 2 rated pro-style quarterback in the country out of Lake Travis High School right outside of Austin, and he was supposed to be the future of Texas football. But it turns out, the future wouldn't be so far away. On the other side, Alabama ran by Nick Saban would have to trot out a new quarterback, Greg McElroy. Greg from Carroll Senior High School in Southlake, Texas was undefeated in his entire high school career. And now he'd be thrown to a second year of Julio Jones out wide, and he'd also get to rely on Mark Ingram, and maybe or maybe not he'd go on to win the Heisman. And the defense was already starting to look like that Alabama standard we'd come to know in the 2010s. The stage was set for both teams. Both fell one game short of making the national championship, and both were determined to make sure it doesn't happen again. But before we get into the season, let's get into recruiting for 2010. Texas had, of course, another monster class. Texas racked up 3 of the top 10 players in the country, being Jordan Hicks, Jackson Jeffcoat, and Mack Davis. Texas would go on to rack up the 2nd overall class in the country according to 247 Sports. Alabama had the 5th overall class, with the best player only being ranked 19th overall, and the class would go on to be highlighted by C.J. Mosley. But the one quarterback they signed out of Oscar Smith High School in Chesapeake, Virginia was named Phillip Sims, and he was the number 1 rated quarterback in the country. On to week 1. Defending champion Florida with the returning Tim Tebow would be ranked number 1 with 58 out of 60 votes. Sitting at 2 was Texas with 2 of the 60 votes. They were right above their rivals Oklahoma, who sat at 3rd, and Alabama, who was at 5th behind USC at 4th. Of course, USC on Pete Carroll's last stand would be ranked top 4 to start the season as always, but they'd have a true freshman quarterback in Matt Barkley out of Mater Dei High School, the number 1 quarterback in the class, the first true freshman to start at Mater Dei, and the first true freshman to start at USC. And right out the gate, Oklahoma would lose to BYU in week 1, with a final score of 14-13, and they fell all the way to 13th in the polls. And most importantly in that game, they'd lose to reigning Heisman Trophy winner Sam Bradford to injury. So now it'd be Florida at number 1, Texas at number 2, USC at number 3, and Alabama at number 4. And week 2 would see the true freshman Matt Barkley in his first big test of his career. USC would have to travel across the entire country to go into a record crowd in the Horseshoe at night to face the Ohio State Buckeyes. Ohio State was 8th, giving us a top 10 matchup, and in a low-scoring affair in a deafening environment, Matt Barkley and Joe McKnight led a game-winning drive in the teeth of the Horseshoe to win 18-15. And then in week 3, without Matt Barkley, who was injured, USC would lose to Washington and fall all the way down to 12th in the polls and were out of the national championship race. So now we were down to 3 heavyweights: Florida, Texas, and Alabama. But guess what? Later that day after USC lost, Texas would have the highly anticipated rematch with Texas Tech. But this time in Austin. But this time Graham Harrell and Michael Crabtree wouldn't be on the other side of the field. This time it'd be Taylor Potts leading Mike Leach's offense. And if you've watched college football long enough, you've seen the Sergio Kendall destroys Potts clip. That sums up the entire game. Mack Brown and the Horns waited a year for this game, and it showed in a 34-24 win. But now creeping up into the top 4 was those LSU Tigers. The Tigers were still trying to figure out the quarterback position between Jarrett Lee and Jordan Jefferson, but they were 5-0 after a 20-13 win versus 18th ranked Georgia. Then the highly anticipated Florida LSU game in Death Valley at night, number 1 versus number 4, and in a defensive battle, Tebow and the Gators would take out the Tigers, and the big 3 was once again Florida, Texas, and Alabama. In the weeks of October 10th and 17th, Alabama had beaten ranked Ole Miss and South Carolina in back-to-back weeks to jump to 2nd, and Texas had their rematch against Oklahoma. Texas had already gotten revenge on the Red Raiders earlier in the year, but against OU, it was now the Longhorns seeking justice. Sam Bradford had been out for 34 straight days, and he'd make his return at the State Fair for one last Red River. Unfortunately for Sam, his quest to beat Texas fell just 3 minutes into the game when Aaron Williams drove him shoulder first into the ground, knocking him out the game. In came Landry Jones, and it was a defensive affair. Neither team could gain a real advantage as Texas led 6-3 at half. In the third, Texas took a 13-6 lead, which was quickly tied at 13. Texas was the number 3 team in the country and needed this win to stay alive for a national title. Oklahoma was already out, but they had the chance to play spoiler one more time, but it wouldn't happen on this day. Texas' go-ahead field goal was enough as Earl Thomas ended things with an interception of Landry Jones. Texas, just like 2008, was 6-0 again. For the next 3 weeks, the top 3 of Florida, Alabama, and Texas would stay the same, except for Texas jumping Alabama on Bama's bye week. Texas had a fairly easy schedule and wasn't tested the rest of the way to the Big 12 title game. Same can be said for Florida en route to the SEC title. Texas had only one ranked matchup after the Oklahoma game, which was a 41-14 win over Oklahoma State. Florida, meanwhile, faced only one ranked team the entire season, that being 4th-ranked LSU in an earlier mentioned 13-3 win. But those Tigers on paper would be Alabama's last major test. November 7th, number 3 versus number 9 to go to the SEC Championship. This was peak football. Julio Jones versus Patrick Peterson. Best on best. LSU had won 4 straight in Tuscaloosa, but it was the Tide who walked away victorious last season in Baton Rouge. Now in at quarterback for LSU, Jordan Jefferson, and his counterpart, Greg McElroy. He came into this game having 0 touchdowns in his last 3 games, and only had 1 more touchdown than sacks so far this entire year. It was a defensive struggle through a scoreless first quarter, but the Tigers struck first in the second for 7. The Tigers defense had held Bama to 3 points through the 2 quarters, and the score was 7-3 at half. Bama needed to win this game to stay alive for a national title, and that led a spark in the offense. McElroy drove right down the field and finally reached the end zone for 6, but those Tigers answered and Bama trailed once again. And after a field goal trailing by 2 in the 4th quarter, Julio Jones showed why he's the number 1 wide receiver in the country, completely flipping the momentum. And with LSU losing hope, Jarrett Lee was inserted for his signature play, an interception versus Alabama with the game in the balance. Only one team was left that could give Alabama a run for their money before Atlanta, unranked Auburn in the Iron Bowl. Crazy things have happened in Jordan Hare, and the Tigers took a 14-0 lead on Alabama, but Bama let it come back to tied at half, and after an eventful second half, Alabama found themselves trailing 21-20 at their own 21 needing to score, and Greg McElroy and Julio Jones single-handedly walked down the field, running almost all the clock, and Roy Upchurch scored the go-ahead touchdown. It was official. Alabama and Florida would meet undefeated number 1 versus number 2 in the SEC Championship for the right to go to Pasadena to play for a national championship. Let's set the stage for Championship Saturday. At 3:30, it'd be number 1 Florida versus number 2 Alabama for the SEC. And in the nightcap, it'd be number 3 Texas versus 22nd ranked Nebraska looking to play spoiler. BCS chaos was definitely possible. And this would also be a day that had major Heisman implications. Alabama's Mark Ingram, Florida's Tim Tebow, Texas's Colt McCoy, and Nebraska's Ndamukong Suh were all in the running, and the 4 of them would face each other on that deciding Saturday. So let's start in the order of events. Florida and Alabama in the rematch everyone wanted to see. Tim Tebow came back to Florida for one reason, an undefeated season, something that had never been done before in Gainesville. The stars for Florida mostly the same minus Percy Harvin, who is now on the Vikings. And for Alabama, it was about vengeance. For 365 days, they waited for this game, the rematch in Atlanta versus Urban Meyer and the Gators. And let's just say they showed it on the field. They made a statement early on in this game, showing a sign of the times in shocking Vernon Gary coming out in a spread offense.
Look at this spread. Wow.
And things just weren't the same in this year's game. Florida had lost their spark. They had never seemed to get things going. Bama started up 9-0, which became 12-3, which became 19-10, and then Florida connected on a field goal to make it 19-13 at half. And that was it. Florida didn't score again. Alabama only scored twice in the second half, and it was enough to win by a stunning score of 32-13. Alabama was battle-tested. They went through tough games against LSU and Auburn in the weeks leading up to this game. Florida, meanwhile, had a cakewalk schedule to Atlanta, never really being tested. In the Swamp Kings documentary on Netflix, Florida's Chris Rainey said, "By the time we got to Alabama, we said it's cool. We beat them last year. We're going to beat them again. But we just went out flat." Others said the energy just wasn't there. Tim Tebow stated that for 365 days, Alabama preached about losing to Florida. They had the edge because they had nothing to lose, and we had everything to lose. On that one afternoon in Atlanta, it all slipped away from Florida. The Gators dynasty was gone. Tebow let his emotions out on the field while the Tide mocked the Gators. And Tim Tebow also says that in his entire career, that's the one game he wants back. To this day, Florida players believe they were the better team talent for talent, but that's not what was shown on the field that day, as Mark Ingram heavily improved his Heisman chances. It is also key to point out that Greg McElroy fractured 2 ribs in the 3rd quarter of the SEC Championship game. Now one half of the BCS Championship was set. All Texas had to do was take care of Nebraska to punch their remaining ticket to the Rose Bowl. Colt McCoy had just missed out on the Heisman last year. A strong showing could potentially win him the award today, but it'd be hard after Mark Ingram's 3-touchdown performance against Florida. But little did McCoy know, it wouldn't be him making his claim for the Heisman. It'd be Nebraska's Ndamukong Suh. This was a game that once it got underway, you could tell BCS chaos was on the horizon. The Texas offensive line had absolutely nothing for Suh. Texas was shut out in the 1st quarter and held to a single touchdown in the 2nd. But luckily for Texas, the defense held Nebraska to just 6 points. 2 weeks to study for Texas' high-powered offense was proving worthy. Texas had averaged 43 points on the year, and here they were struggling to cross midfield. TCU was glued to their television sets as an upset would possibly send them to Pasadena. The game came down to the wire, and it was Texas who scored the sole 3 points of the third to take a 10-6 lead. And then Nebraska scored the next 6 to take a 12-10 lead with a minute 44 to go. Sue on the night had an NFL Pro Bowl level performance. If Nebraska wins, how could you deny him the Heisman? Sue had a team high 12 tackles, 7 were behind the line of scrimmage, and that included 4.5 sacks, a Big 12 title game record. He was a game wrecker, and he got Nebraska on the verge of a generational upset to be talked about for decades to come. Texas had one last chance. They remember how they felt last year in Lubbock, seeing their title hopes fade in a matter of seconds, and it was happening once again. McCoy, with the game on the line, rolled right and threw the ball out of bounds, and time expired. Nebraska had done it. They caused BCS chaos and upset Texas, until they didn't. Mack Brown and Texas urgently pushed for a second to be added back, and replay review confirmed the decision and added a second back on the clock. That gave Texas' Hunter Lawrence a 46-yard field goal attempt to send Texas to the national championship. McCoy's Heisman chances were gone, and Sue upstaged him with what might be the greatest defensive performance ever. But it wasn't enough, and by the skin of their teeth, Texas had punched their ticket to Pasadena. McCoy was going to have to shake off his 3-interception performance where he was sacked 9 times. And of course, the Heisman went to Alabama's Mark Ingram. Alabama had ended one dynasty. Now it was time to start theirs. The year-long goals for Texas and Alabama were clear. Revenge. Alabama had taken down the team that stopped them a year ago, Florida. Texas had avenged their loss to Texas Tech and once again beat Oklahoma. Now the two teams had one game left to complete a lifelong dream. From the moment Julio Jones signed to play with Nick Saban, this was the goal. A program that 3 years ago fired their head coach was now looking to win a national championship. For Texas, their seniors saw the 2005 team win a national championship in this very stadium versus USC. Now they wanted their own. The hype for this game was incredible. It truly looked like it'd be the perfect sequel to the last national championship in the Rose Bowl, when Texas stunned USC. Colt McCoy was looking for a record 46 victory as a starting quarterback. The other quarterback, Greg McElroy, hadn't lost a game since the 8th grade. At the end of the night, who would be number 1 and officially complete their revenge season? And the game got off to a fiery start. Texas defense forced a massive 3-and-out, leading to 4th and 23, and Saban immediately went against his philosophy and fake punted it from his own 20, which would be intercepted by Blake Gideon. All of a sudden, Texas had great field position and all the momentum, and then knocking on the doorstep of the end zone came the fateful moment that defined this game. Marcel Darius banged into Colt McCoy, sending him to the sideline injured, and he'd never play a snap of football at the University of Texas again. So remember when I said remember the name Garrett Gilbert? Well, now he'd be thrown in the fire. As an untested true freshman in the national championship against the number 1 team in the land, how would the highly touted 5-star recruit handle this moment? Of course, in football, as a backup, you're always one play away from seeing the field, but for it to happen this quick was unfathomable. Colt had survived a mauling in December against Nebraska, and now just minutes into the title, he was out. Garrett Gilbert now, 6'4", 207 pounds, he'd only had 26 pass attempts on the year, and Texas would have to settle for a field goal on the drive. Alabama had the number 1 red zone defense in the country. Of course, a true freshman wouldn't be able to capitalize. Colt walked to the locker room with Texas up 3-0, and yet again Texas had another chance at 6. Alabama fumbled the ensuing kick return, and Texas would start from the Alabama 30, and yet again it ended in a field goal. Is the score more than 6-0 with the all-time career leader in wins Colt McCoy under center? Who knows? But seeing they dodged a bullet, it was now time for Alabama to settle in. After all, they had the best receiver in the country, Julio Jones, and the best player in the country, the Heisman Trophy winner, Mark Ingram. Alabama was shut out in the first quarter, but they immediately opened the second quarter with a touchdown from the Heisman Trophy winner, and the floodgates would just open up from there. Just to put an emphasis on how important McCoy is, the Texas offense with McCoy still had more yards than Gilbert's offense with 9:30 left in the second quarter. The offense completely shut down with the inexperienced true freshman under center. Alabama knew they could play field position, and that they did until they took a 14-6 lead on a 49-yarder by freshman Trent Richardson. And what was looking like an all-time great battle in the Rose Bowl was quickly turning into a question of could Texas even get a first down? They had yet to do so under Gilbert. But wait, the offense finally found something, and then it come to a screeching halt with Javier Arenas intercepting young Gilbert. Despite all that was going on, the Texas defense was keeping them in it. It was an 11-point game with just 15 seconds to go in the half, a chance to get to the locker room and regroup. And then Texas would put the ball in harm's way, and of course, Marcel Darius would intercept it and take it to the house to make it a 24-6 ball game. Shocking. Nobody could have seen this coming at kickoff, but it just seemed a formality that Alabama would win the national championship. Texas had just 5 passing yards in the first half. It didn't seem they'd be able to get anything going. But as bad as we've talked about the Texas offense, Alabama's offense wasn't looking all-world either. McElroy, with 7 minutes left in the third quarter, had just 3 pass completions for 39 yards. Yes, Mark Ingram was having a monster game. Yes, Trent Richardson was having a monster game. But the lack of a passing attack was allowing Texas to now key in on the backs. And it was stop after stop after stop. It's so crazy seeing this in a national championship, but Garrett Gilbert, with 1:49 to go in the third quarter, was 5 for 23 for 61 yards and 2 interceptions. And then all of a sudden, something clicked. Jordan Shipley came alive. A 44-yard touchdown, and Texas somehow, someway, had life. Gilbert might be 6 for 25, but now he had 105 yards and a touchdown to his name. And Alabama let Texas hang around too long, and it was just an 11-point game once again. And it'd be 24-13 at the end of 3. Could Alabama just hold off Texas for 15 more minutes? They had just 3 yards in the third quarter, and that Texas defense once again stood strong, forcing a missed 52-yard field goal. And as time winded down, a once dormant Texas had life. Garrett Gilbert in the second half was now 7 for 19 for 111 yards and a touchdown after the disastrous first half. Jordan Shipley was having the game of his life. And once again, Gilbert would find him in the end zone, their second touchdown of the night. And young Gilbert, the 5-star true freshman, was growing up in front of our eyes. A 28-yard touchdown followed by a successful 2-point conversion to Buckner made this just a 3-point game, 24-21. A comeback for the ages perhaps. The pressure was now on Alabama to avoid a monumental collapse. Shipley, who had just 1 catch for 5 yards in half number 1, had 9 catches for 117 yards and 2 touchdowns in the second so far. It really seemed Texas was going to be able to pull this off. McElroy, with the game on the line, now had just 6 pass completions through 3.5 quarters. How could they possibly turn it around now? Well, they didn't. They were forced to punt at midfield, and now Garrett Gilbert, the true freshman, was 93 yards and 11 crimson jerseys away from the greatest comeback maybe ever. He started 4 for 22 with 2 interceptions, but since then he was 10 for 14 for 120 yards and 2 touchdowns. Texas truly believed, and then it all come to a screeching halt. Eric Anders came unblocked off the edge for the first sack of the game, and most importantly, the game-deciding fumble. Alabama took advantage of the short field, and the Heisman winner decided to end things with his second touchdown. Now down 10 with the game basically out of balance, Gilbert would throw yet another interception, and there would be one last Alabama touchdown to officially end things. The once comeback for the ages has come to an end, and Alabama were the national champions of college football. And for years, people have said, what if Colt McCoy didn't get hurt? And that definitely would have changed everything. Colt McCoy doesn't start the game 4 for 22 and have a costly turnover right before half to extend the Bama lead, but he did get hurt. So a different question is, what if Mack plays it safe and doesn't call the pitch that led to a pick six with just seconds left in the second quarter? Because that would mean when Gilbert led the Horns back to within 3 in the fourth quarter, it would have been Alabama who would have needed to drive down the field, with what to that point had been an inept passing offense to take the lead. McElroy finished the game with just 58 total yards. And yes, it is important to mention that in the SEC Championship game, he did fracture 2 ribs. But it's really interesting to see how the rest of the game would have unfolded in this scenario. But again, this is all hypothetical, and Alabama finished the game winning 37-21 with multiple scores in the final minute. And this game changed the direction of both programs. Saban went on to win 5 more national championships with Alabama, and Texas went on to still recruit at a very elite level but couldn't replicate the same success on the field. Gilbert eventually transferred to SMU after a not-so-good tenure as Texas starting quarterback. Matt Brown eventually resigned in 2013, and Texas went through multiple different head coaches who'd failed before landing Steve Sarkisian. The SEC Championship against Florida can officially be marked as the start of the dynasty, but January 7, 2010 in the Rose Bowl against Texas will forever go down as the night Alabama sent Texas into a downward spiral, and the night Alabama notched their first national championship under Nick Saban, the first of 6 in a run we'll more than likely never see again. If you enjoyed this video, then please like and subscribe to the channel, comment your thoughts on this video, and check out one of my other videos. This one is what happened to every preseason #1 ranked team this century.